Today in this video, we will explore all the cases of women who, after committing horrific crimes, will face the death penalty in the United States in the coming years. Patricia Blackman. Patricia Blackman called emergency services to report that her adopted daughter, Dominique, was not breathing. When the paramedics team examined her, they discovered severe injuries including a fractured skull, broken bones, bruises, and a shoe mark on her chest. Investigation revealed that Blackman had inflicted these fatal injuries. She was convicted of capital murder in 2002, with the jury voting 10-2 in favor of the death penalty. Her case remains in the appeals process. Christy Michelle Scott. Christy Michelle Scott intentionally set fire to her home, which causing the death of her 6-year-old son Mason. Investigators found that she had recently increased Mason's life insurance policies and searched for fire-related deaths online. She was convicted of capital murder in 2009, with the judge imposing the death penalty despite the jury's recommendation for life imprisonment. Her case remains under appeal. Shauna Ford. Shauna Ford, a former border vigilante, planned a home invasion targeting Raul Flores, believing he was involved in drug trafficking. During the robbery, both Raul and his 9-year-old daughter Brazenia were fatally shot. Ford and her accomplices were arrested and convicted of multiple crimes. In 2011, she was sentenced to death and remains incarcerated at the Lumley unit of the Arizona State Prison Complex, awaiting further legal proceedings. Wendy Andriano. Wendy Andriano poisoned her terminally ill husband Joe, using sodium azide, a highly toxic substance. When the poison did not take effect immediately, she brutally attacked him with a bar stool until he died. In 2004, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She is currently held in the Lumley unit of the Arizona State Prison Complex. Tiara Capri Goebel. Emergency responders found 4-month-old Cody Parrish unconscious, and he was later pronounced dead at the hospital. The autopsy revealed that he had suffered severe head trauma due to violent shaking or a strong impact. Investigators determined that his mother, Tiara Capri Goebel, was responsible for his fatal injuries. In 2005, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated with her case still under appeal. Michelle Lynn Michaud. Michelle Lynn Michaud and her partner James Anthony DeVirgilio kidnapped 22-year-old Vanessa Sampson, subjected her to extreme mistreatment, and ultimately murdered her. The couple abandoned her body in a snowbank near South Lake Tahoe. In 2002, both were convicted and sentenced to death. Michaud remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Valerie D. Martin. Valerie D. Martin, along with her 16-year-old son and 2 other accomplices, attacked and locked her partner, William Whiteside, in the trunk of his car before setting it on fire. In 2010, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Maureen McDermott. Maureen McDermott, a former nurse, hired an accomplice to murder her roommate, Stephen Eldridge, in an attempt to collect his life insurance. The victim was stabbed 44 times. In 1990, she was convicted and sentenced to death, becoming one of the longest-serving women on death row in California. Catherine Thompson. Catherine Thompson orchestrated the murder of her husband, Melvin Thompson, to collect a $400,000 life insurance policy. She hired Philip Conrad Sanders to carry out the crime. In 1993, she was convicted and sentenced to death. She remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility. Manling Sang Williams. Manling Sang Williams suffocated her 2 children with a pillow and attacked her husband with a samurai sword, inflicting over 90 wounds. In 2010, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Sherry LaShawn Rhodes. Sherry LaShawn Rhodes. During a tribal eviction hearing, Sherry Rhodes opened fire, killing 4 people including her brother and niece. She then attempted to stab a 5th victim before being apprehended. In 2017, she was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Maria del Rocio Alfaro. Maria Alfaro broke into the home of 9-year-old Autumn Wallace to steal valuables. When the girl encountered her, Alfaro brutally stabbed her over 50 times. In 1992, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Skylar Preciosa de Leon. Skylar de Leon posing as a buyer for a yacht and forced Thomas and Jackie Hawks to sign over ownership before tying them to an anchor and throwing them into the sea. In 2008, de Leon was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison. Tanya Jamie Nelson. Tanya Nelson, angered by a psychic's advice, traveled from North Carolina to California and murdered the psychic and her daughter by stabbing them multiple times. She attempted to cover her tracks by painting the victims' faces. In 2007, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Jessica Marie Han. Jessica Marie Han, formerly Jason Michael Han, murdered her 2 infant children over a span of 2 years, hiding their bodies in storage units. In 2013, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Lorraine Allison Hunter. Lorraine Allison Hunter, along with her teenage daughter, orchestrated the murder of her husband, Albert Hunter, to claim a $1 million life insurance policy. She was convicted of first-degree murder in 2018 and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Heather Level Keaton. Heather Level Keaton poisoned and later suffocated her partner's 2 children, 3-year-old Chase and 4-year-old Natalie. Their bodies were found in the woods of Alabama and Mississippi. In 2015, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Susan Diane Eubanks. Susan Diane Eubanks shot and killed her 4 children, Brandon, 14, Austin, 7, Brigham, 6, and Matthew, 4, before attempting suicide. She survived and was convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder in 1999. Due to legal changes, her sentence was commuted to life without parole in 2024. Belinda Magana. Belinda Magana, along with her boyfriend, tortured and killed her 2-year-old son, Malachi Magana. The child suffered severe abuse, including burns and bruises. In 2015, she was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Veronica Gonzalez. Veronica Gonzalez, along with her husband, Ivan Gonzalez, inflicted severe abuse on her 4-year-old niece, Jenny Rojas. The child was forced to live in a box, burned, and ultimately killed by blunt force trauma. Veronica was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and sentenced to death in 1998. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Brooke Marie Rodriguez. Brooke Marie Roderick and her accomplices lured 2 men to a motel room under false pretenses, then robbed and suffocated them. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2010. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Kathy Lynn Sariñana. Kathy Lynn Sariñana and her husband brutally abused and murdered their 2 young nephews. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2009. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Carrie Lynn Dalton. Carrie Lynn Dalton was convicted of orchestrating the kidnapping, prolonged torture, and murder of another woman. She was sentenced to death in 1995 and has been on death row for over 35 years. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman. Cynthia Lynn Kaufman, along with her partner, kidnapped and murdered multiple women in a series of crimes across California and Arizona. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1990. She remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Kimberly Cargill. Kimberly Cargill killed her babysitter, Cherry Walker, to prevent her from testifying in a child protection case. She suffocated Walker, burnt her body, and left it in a rural area. Cargill was convicted in 2012 and sentenced to death. She remains incarcerated in Texas.